Hi there, I'm Jim Zirin. Welcome back to More Conversations. We can almost take it as a given that Donald Trump is not about the truth. David Frum observes in Trumpocracy, the corruption of the American Republic, no American president in history, no national political figure of any kind since at least Senator Joe McCarthy has trafficked more in untruths than Donald Trump. The Washington Post's fact checker keeps a running tally of Trump's lies since entering office. As of October 2018, it documented 6,420 false and misleading claims in the 649 days since he took the oath of office. That's an average of nearly 9.9 false claims a day, and we may be sure that the number is steadily growing. Trump is responsible for what the Rand Corporation aptly calls truth decay in American political discourse. Truth decay Rand defines as an increase in the relative influence of opinion and personal experience over fact and declining trust in formerly respected sources of factual information. But did fake news, conspiracy theories, and factual fantasy start with Donald Trump? With us is Kurt Andersen. Kurt Andersen is a noted writer and host and co-creator of the WNYC radio show Studio 360. In his latest book, Fantasyland, How America Went Haywire, a 500-year history, he argues that untruth in American political discourse did not start with Donald Trump and will most likely not end with him either. We are delighted to welcome Kurt Andersen to this table. Now, Kurt, is your book about Donald Trump?
It's not only not about Donald Trump. I was conceiving of it and mostly finished with it before Donald Trump even had the nomination. It's a sort of my alternative theory of American history that I've been playing around with for a long time and writing the book for several years before Trump came along. He just appeared and became the almost mind-boggling poster boy for my entire theory of this tradition, this deep part of the American character that is about believing the untrue and the unreal.
Do you believe the untrue and unreal has wounded our democracy?
Well, I think the degree to which it's gotten out of control, that your truth is your truth and my truth is my truth, and empirical reality and the will to objectivity have gone away. And yes, among other things, it indeed has severely damaged our politics and our democracy, and on the verge of making running a society and having a politics that functions impossible.
But you quote Jefferson in your book, who said you can believe in 20 gods as long as you don't break my legs or pick my pockets. That's kind of at odds, isn't it, with your argument?
Well, that was 230 years ago. Things have changed. It is. I mean, I am in that sense a Jeffersonian, and he also said you could believe in no God or 20 gods, and as long as you don't pick my pocket or break my leg, it's fine with me. And that is the basis of the good laissez-faire tolerance of America. You can believe anything you want. But to that point, my argument is that a lot of these things are breaking our legs, whether it's the fantasies about we don't need gun regulation of any kind, or the fantasies about climate change. They harm us individually. The fantasy that you don't need to vaccinate your children. They are breaking our legs in all kinds of ways, and that's when it's a problem. Yeah, you can believe whatever crazy thing you want if you believe it in the privacy of your own home or your club or whatever it is. But as soon as it gets into the public sphere, that's a problem.
Well, are you a declinist? I mean, are you really observing the decline of the West as a result of fantasy?
Well, I've never thought of myself as a declinist, and I have poo-pooed and raised my eyebrows at declinist over the years. People say, oh, it's just like Rome. Oh, it's all going to hell. I have rejected that, just temperamentally almost. As I began this book and began researching and discovered really how deep this goes and how bad it's gotten, I won't say I'm a declinist but I will say that I've never been more worried about the American future as a result of this loss of trust in a shared set of facts.
But despite all the fantasy, I mean, aren't we living in an era of hope? We've accomplished so much. We elected Obama president, first African-American president. We have reduced murders. We've
There are many.
decoded the genome. You could point to all sorts of advances that argue against a decline.
Well, yeah, and I point to those and more at the end of the book to say, look, it's not all bad. It's not all disastrous. We're not entirely dysfunctional. We're still this incredibly prosperous country, but that isn't to say, oh, we'll get over this thing and Trump will be gone. It'll be back to normal, because I don't think it's going back to normal. As I say, I wrote this book before there was a Trump. Trump is a symptom. He's not the cause. And so the pathology, if you will, that he was able to exploit and turn into the presidency is gonna outlive him. And it is a real problem, which is, and I think sooner rather than later, it can affect things like our economic success. If suddenly, take climate change. I mean, as the most recent report of the Inter-Federal Task Force.
His own administration's report.
Which says this is going to really put a damper on GDP growth if we don't get it under control. So in addition to it being terrifying to me that people are running wild with their fantastical beliefs in all kinds of ways, and that makes society and culture difficult to maintain as we've maintained it, I think it will and is having real material effects on our prosperity and everything else.
Well, you go back to John Adams, who said facts are stubborn things, and I know you're fond of quoting Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who said you're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts. And yet, Americans like to believe what in the hell they want to believe.
Right, and again, fine, and difference of opinion and debate.
I'm from Missouri. Show me.
Yes, exactly. But sometime over the last 50 years, and now I'm old enough to have seen this change. It's changed. That 30, 40 years ago, even 25 years ago, there was still a kind of trust in the experts who deserved to be experts because they knew more than I did or you did about certain subjects. And that changed. And what we arrived at is a place where, yeah, people are entitled to their own opinions and really don't see no distinction between fact and opinion. What their opinion is a fact, and what they don't want to believe, they don't want to believe even if the world recognizes it as a truth. And again, every day the president shows that. No, I don't see that this head of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia ordered any kind of murder. No, I don't think climate change is real. The president every day is saying, despite just plain evidence about subjects large and small, that he doesn't believe things. That certainly gives further permission to Americans to believe whatever they wish. Evidence be damned.
But, you go back to the Pilgrims, and you do in the book, and the Puritans, and the Salem witch trials, and spectral evidence, and Cotton Mather, the end of the world. And Americans have been fantasizing forever. I mean, even in the 19th century, the age of hucksterism, P.T. Barnum, Buffalo Bill, you cover all of that.
Yep.
Patent medicine, snake oil salesmen. Yep. And we still in our drugstores, they sell a lot of stuff that does us no good, no harm perhaps, but no good. Yeah. Patent medicines.
Yeah. No. And what we had is for most of the 20th century, the arc the great arc was bending toward reasonableness and rationality in America as in the rest of the developed world. And then in the last few decades, we diverged in all kinds of ways in allowing and believing that all kinds of patent medicines and nostrums and fake elixirs work.
John D. Rockefeller Sr. was a snake oil salesman.
And then his sons became reasonable, billionaire businessmen.
With the real thing.
Exactly. Oil being the real thing in that case. So there seemed to be an arc of history that's my worry, is that we've always had hucksters, we've always had the belief in the untrue, whether it's Hollywood's version or P.T. Barnum's version.
Or Madison Avenue's version. But when push came to shove, the reasonable experts were in control, and that control was really abdicated at a certain point over the last half century. Well, do you suppose we really went off the rails in the 1960s, where people started believing in relativism, and there's no right and wrong, there's only relative right and wrong.
Yeah.
And,
Well, right and wrong is one thing. It's the true or untrue, or science is real or science is not. It's that relativism as opposed to the moral relativism, that too, but that's a different question. And I'll leave that aside. It's no, I believe that my amulet is just as powerful as this nuclear reactor because I do. That's what started in the 60s. Yes, the 60s were a kind of wellspring of find your own truth, believe what you want, do your own thing. And obviously, many, many, many great things came out of the 1960s. Civil rights, the beginning of environmentalism, feminism, all the rest. But also this indulgence of believing the preposterous and the unreal and the untrue. And over time, it exponentially increased in the last 20 years. I think in our politics especially, we see where that has brought us.
But also the 60s brought us into a drug culture where, Timothy Leary's famous statement, if you remember the 60s, you weren't there.
Right.
Right. And so the 60s have a lot to answer for.
The 60s do have a lot to answer for, and which of course has been a conservative critique since the 60s. What's the grand irony of what the 60s in the sense we're talking about has given us? It's empowered more than the lunacies on the left, the lunacies on the political right, the shape of that history and its sort of tragic irony is something that was one of the things that fueled this book.
But even the elites have believed in fantasy. If you look at Nancy Reagan, had an astrologer on retainer, and Scalia said he believed in the devil. What we make of all this? These are our national leaders.
They are. No,
our national icons.
It's not. Yes, and although the belief in fantasies and the untrue and the unprovable and the preposterous, at this point It is on the left, on the right, elite as well as uneducated, but it is not symmetrically distributed, right? Unfortunately, it has become far more of a kind of right-wing tick and indulgence for a lot of historical reasons, and it is not unconnected to education. Here we are. I mean, where a certain kind of democracy of belief, of epistemology has sort of spun out of control.
So epistemology is how do we know what the world is?
Right.
And are we now have we seen a polarization of epistemology where people, rather than disagreeing about religious beliefs or political beliefs, they're disagreeing about facts, and they are vehemently
Correct.
Opposed to the counterfacts, which may be true or may not be true.
It's true. That's correct. And so we had what happened in a kind of epistemological way in the 60s, and people could believe their own truths and in all that meant for good and, in my opinion, mostly for ill. And then we had the technological revolution. We had the internet, which gave an unprecedented infrastructure for this kind of make-believe reality that I'm talking about. Suddenly, before, the crackpots were limited to their crummy newsletters and privately printed books. Now, all of those crackpots and all of those false theories and beliefs have websites that full of apparent facts that look as real as the New York Times. So,
with which you can interact.
With which you can interact and with which you can be recruited and recruit fellow believers in these fantasies and falsehoods, which we've never had before. So it really is, again, my book argues that we've always been this way since the beginning, nearly 400 years of European settlers in what is now the United States. But it was in various ways under control. And this, when the internet came along, when it did, it became a kind of perfect storm, mixing with our natural character toward believing the untrue, along with what happened in the 1960s, along with no doubt the economic stagnation of the last 40 years, which, among other things, I think leads people to kind of have a grip on fantastical beliefs that console or thrill or somehow sustain them.
Conspiracy theories that, about Kennedy, about a deep state, about almost anything.
Well, and again, another thing that happened in the 60s, not coincidentally, as to the new agey sort of well springs of the 1960s were conspiracy theories, starting with the assassination of Kennedy, which, and then shortly thereafter, some real conspiracies like Watergate, which made people think, well, everything is a conspiracy. There are real conspiracies. Most things that you don't like or that are evil or bad aren't the result of conspiracies, but it became a kind of habit of mind that has gotten out of control.
And how did this progression evolve from the 1960s and era? It seemed to be somehow or other consistent with the Enlightenment, to Kellyanne Conway talking about the sort of alternate facts George Orwell talked about in 1984.
Part of it began with an extreme version of this good American tradition of tolerance, or Thomas Jefferson saying, I don't care if you believe in 20 gods or no gods. So, you believe this kooky, nutty thing? Okay, fine, whatever. Of course that should be legal, must still be legal. That's our Constitution, that's the First Amendment. But the kind of, in the institutions of society, academic, media, and otherwise, that used to stigmatize crazy, kooky, untrue beliefs, sort of held back and abdicated that responsibility, and then there was money to be made in promoting falsehoods in cable television, and I'm not even talking about cable news, non-fiction channels suddenly putting on documentaries about mermaids and monsters from outer space and all kinds of crazy things as though they're real. So there's a lot of culpability to go around. Some of it's about religion, some of it's about, hey, I can make a buck doing this. It varies. Some of it's cynical, some of it's sincere, but it's all led us to a place, I think, that's it's going to be hard to get out of. I think we can make it not get a lot of worse if enough of us in the reality-based community come together to do that and plant the flag. But I don't see it sort of cycling back to normal. I don't see the pendulum swinging back.
If it cycles back, we could go back to Orson Welles and the War of the Worlds, and the Martians are coming, and people are getting out of their cars, and they're ducking under cover because the Martians are coming.
Yes, well,
I mean, the further back we go, the more fantasy there appears to be.
Well, if we go back all the way to the 13th, 14th century, then we're in the Dark Ages again, and could happen.
Could happen.
Yeah.
And then you have the phenomenon nostalgia, which may be a fantasy in and of itself. We were talking before about Brexit and the nostalgia for the British Empire, but somehow or other the belief that if we could take it back to where it was before, undefined, we'd be much better off. It was a simpler, better, easier, and freer life.
Of course, it was. We're always, it's true that we always think, oh, it was so much better in the past. It used to be so much better.
The good old days.
That's the good old days thing. But nostalgia itself, nostalgia was an actual illness before it was a thing we all occasionally feel, a fondness for the past. And
it's like hysteria.
It was hysteria over like soldiers who were too long away from home. Then it became a thing actual people felt about an actual past they had experienced. And then, in the last century or so, it has become a story that somebody believes about a place and a time they've never been, but they're still nostalgic for it. So, and I think that kind of that fond, sad, backward-looking quality. Again, we're all nostalgic for things, but you can go overboard, and I think we've gone overboard in imagining that everything was so much better back when. It's always the best of times and worst of times. I just worry that right now, the worst of times is getting ahead of the best of times.
Well, I mean, you look at the last presidential campaign where really all of the Republican candidates repudiated evolution.
Well, it's extraordinary, and that's I didn't know until I did the research on that how quickly that happened, how quickly the collapse of the reality-based grown-ups in charge of the Republican Party happened. That two presidential cycles ago, 2/3, 3/4 of the candidates, when asked on a debate stage if they believed in evolution, said yes. Suddenly, in 2016, Jeb Bush, alone among those 17 people, said, yep, I believe in evolution, although I don't want to push it on anybody, and it should be taught along with creationism in the schools. That's amazing how, it was gradual, and then suddenly, kaboom, it was required of Republican presidential candidates to say, no, I don't believe in this well-established fundamental part of science. So when you have situations like that, it's hard to maintain hopeful, despite all of the fantastic, hopeful, great things that, of course, are still going on in our country.
But what about the Wild West? We're nostalgic for the Wild West, where everyone carried a gun.
Correct.
And say in the 19th century, Buffalo Bill made a fortune because he claimed to be an Indian fighter, and he had a show, a Wild West show.
Yeah, playing himself.
He took it around the country. People came to see it. They believed what they saw.
Yep.
And now everyone has to have a gun. We're the most armed country in the West.
We are. There are our competitors in being as armed as we are very few and not developed nations. No, it is extraordinary, and yes, there are actual historical reasons about our development in the frontier and so forth that lends a certain mystique and appeal to firearms, but it is way beyond certainly hunting, which a tiny single-digit percentage of Americans now do, beyond any reasonable or realistic sense of self-protection. It is a fantasy. I need this semi-automatic rifle, or 10 of them, or 20 of them, because why? Because maybe someday we'll need to rise up against the tyrannical government or whatever. It is.
The most common argument is we need it to protect ourselves against the government, and particularly when Obama was president, because Obama's going to come and take our guns away.
So we need our guns to stop that.
We need to stop that.
Yes. No, it is in that instance, this tautological fantasy. I want my guns. They want my guns. I need to shoot them if they come for my guns.
Yes.
Yeah.
And this is not really exclusively a white phenomenon, because people like Charles Blow, New York Times, says we had lots of guns in our family. We had in Louisiana. We needed them because who knows when the Ku Klux Klan would come to harass us.
Well, and in our recent history, before the NRA was a organization of lunatics, in the 1960s and early 70s, it was the people like the Black Panthers who wanted to be able to carry guns in the open and protect themselves. It wasn't yet an entirely or mainly right-wing set of fantasies about resisting the state.
Yeah, Rap Brown was prosecuted for carrying a gun across the state line, and he said violence is as American as blueberry pie.
Right,
It's rather scary. But now let's get down to Donald Trump. You have this history and tradition of fantasy, conspiracy theories, longing for the past. How does he fit into all this? Did he tap into it?
He did tap into it, and although he's not an intellectual,
is he a Christian?
Well, that's the one part of my history that he doesn't conform to. He is not a fervently believing Christian. But our most fervently believing Christians, many of them, the Protestant evangelicals, are great supporters of him for a whole set of reasons. What they haven't among the
things because they believe a sinner will lead us into the kingdom of heaven.
Well, that's one thing they believe. I don't know that Donald Trump puts it quite that way, but they believe that they are inclined to believe extravagant, unprovable things, and in Donald Trump's case, they're not about the imminent return of Jesus Christ, but they have that in common, and they have a cultural resentment of the secular elite in common. But what Donald Trump has, he embodies all the other parts of my theory and my history about wanting to believe the untrue, and the part of it that really started in the 19th century, where America invented modern show business and popular culture, and popular culture and entertainment sort of subsumed everything, entertainment, religion, all the rest of our life, all the other parts of life.
My question is, are we at peak fantasy land in American history as we sit here today?
That is the hope. That is my fond, great hope, is that we are at peak fantasy land, and that to the degree that Donald Trump embodies that and will end badly by the consent of a large majority of Americans, will perhaps lead us out of this slough of Fantasyland and somewhat back to the idea that maybe the experts have something after all. Maybe we should believe scientists. Maybe whatever nutty thing I happened to see on the internet last night should not govern how I live my life or how I vote. Exactly.
Kurt Andersen, thank you
My
so
great
much
pleasure.
for coming by.
Thank you.
My great pleasure, and thank you for coming by. Tune in next week for more conversations. I'm Jim Zirin. All the best and take care.